While quarantines are new to most people, they've been around for quite some time. And surprisingly, the oldest recorded instances of these come from religious texts. In Leviticus 13, about the 5th century BC, the Bible had people who had skin lesions be isolated from 7 to 14 days because they were unclean. Basically, this helped prevent the spread of disease. And then we have the Quran with Prophet Muhammad himself saying, "If you hear there is a plague in the land, do not go to it. If there is a plague in the land you are in, do not leave it." Now, unfortunately, in Europe, the whole idea of quarantine was hampered by the miasma theory of disease. Basically, the idea was that disease comes not from person to person, but from inhaling noxious fumes from the environment. Basically, it's related to the four humors theory of the body. So why would you separate people out if they're not the ones causing people to get sick? Now, of course, people aren't dumb. They would eventually catch on about the transmission of disease, but it would take quite some time. And one of the worst plagues in history, the Black Death. The first recorded quarantine procedure we have comes from the city of Ragusa in now Dubrovnik, Croatia. And I'm sorry if I pronounced those wrong, I probably did. The city's doctor, Jacob of Padua, set up an isolation facility outside the city's walls where patients would be quarantined for 30 days. Anyone who broke this was imprisoned and got a fine. Sound familiar to anyone? Eventually, this 30-day period got extended to 40 days, which is where we get the modern word quarantine from. The Italian word for 40 days is quarantino, which of course was anglicized to quarantine. The first quarantine hospitals were isolated from populations by distance and barriers, and that would be the case in the future as well. The first true quarantine system was set up by the city of Venice, where all ships would stop, the captain would come off the boat with documentation of the ship, including the health and such, and they would talk to a city official through a tiny little window several feet away. Now, just like we have social distancing in the modern era, they had social distancing back then. Eventually this spread to the rest of Europe. The first English quarantine law was in 1710. Remember, we were part of England back then. And ships were required to wait off the Thames in London. And unfortunately, at the time, there wasn't very much enforcement and not enough people to enforce it. Therefore, they eventually had to bump up the quarantine law to carry the death penalty if you broke quarantine. In the United States, it was up to the individual colonies. The first city quarantine law was in New York in 1688 and later in Boston in 1691. And for the bulk of the early years of our country, the quarantine laws were in the hands of each individual state. There was no overarching system for the entire country. Here on the Delaware River, the first quarantine facility was located 10 miles south of Philadelphia in order to try to combat yellow fever. At that point in time, about 1/10 of the entire city of Philadelphia had died from yellow fever. Unfortunately, it was entirely ineffective, as yellow fever is spread by mosquitoes, not humans. Therefore, it just didn't work. Eventually, though, the city was saved by a cold snap, which killed all the bugs. In 1798, President John Adams signed a bill for the relief of sick and disabled seamen. This imposed a 20-cent tax on sailors, about $5 today, and set up a system of marine hospitals for them and for quarantine purposes. 14 years later, the first quarantine station on this chunk of land, on October 20th, 1884, was built. The quarantine station here at Cape Henlopen was mainly for Philadelphia and Wilmington traffic, some of the busiest ports in the entire nation. The quarantine station here was named the Delaware Breakwater Quarantine Station for the 2,500-foot massive stone breakwater, which was constructed in 1828 by the federal government. Pier. This, believe it or not, was the second largest in the world at the time. Remember, back then they were either using chisels or gunpowder. They didn't have any heavy equipment or really good explosive. This breakwater was designed to shelter ships from storms as there was no natural harbor here at the mouth of the Delaware. This site was 40 acres, about 3 miles from town. Now, this might not seem like much today, like about 5 minutes, but back then, it was the better part of an hour for a horse to walk. So it was physically isolated, it was barren dunes as far as you could see. Those sailors were not going anywhere. There was originally 6 beds in the hospital, but eventually blossomed to over 1,200 beds at its peak. Here's how it worked. When a ship arrived that had sick people on it, they would raise the yellow flag. This yellow flag was Q in the standard marine language for flags, which is kind of cute. I mean, after all, Q for quarantine and such. Not to mention the fact that, we don't really use Q very much in language, therefore it was a safe letter to use. Then a team of doctors would row out to the boat in a ship called a skiff. They would inspect the crew and passengers, and if any were found to be sick, they would be brought back to the hospital for quarantine. All their belongings would be then fumigated using steam and sulfur. If you ever smelled sulfur, it's really nasty stuff. It smells like rotten eggs. And then they'd be stuck here for quarantine. The ship itself would have been stuck here for up to 12 weeks, just to make sure no one else on the ship was sick. Though it was originally only open from May to October, the station had so much traffic that they eventually bumped up to full time in 1895 to accommodate the bigger steamship that could travel throughout the year, unlike the sailing ships who were pretty much in harbor during the winter. The station would inspect up to 8 ships a day, and only 5% of all passengers had communicable diseases. Ultimately, World War I brought an end to the influx of refugees, but by the time it had closed, over 200,000 people had passed through the quarantine station. After sitting idle for a time, the Delaware Breakwater Quarantine Station was taken over by the Navy during World War I, and it did have a brief stint after that as a quarantine station again, but it was eventually closed in 1926. In September 1937, Secretary of the Treasury Wayne C. Taylor issued an order for the demolition of all the buildings of the quarantine station, which is why there's nothing here today. Just dunes and a lovely state park. While quarantining was very effective, it did have some dark sides. Of course, if you didn't have a disease at the start and you were put into quarantine, you were much more likely to catch the disease yourself. Also, governments have been known to abuse the power of quarantine. In 1892, there was an outbreak of typhus in New York City. It was linked to a passenger ship with Russian Jewish immigrants. And they gathered up all of the Russian Jewish immigrants and put them on a small island with little food and water. However, they ignored every other passenger on that ship. Very, very anti-Semitic. By the time they got off the island, only about 50 people out of the over 1,000 who were quarantined had gotten sick, and they were so weak that they could barely walk. In the early 1900s, there was a quarantine in San Francisco of the Chinese population. They basically said that they were more likely as a race to carry bubonic plague. Of course, this is ridiculous. And they even granted passes to the white people who were living in that area. The federal courts did not take too kindly on this, and it was struck down fairly quickly, but the blight on quarantine still stands. So the Marine Hospital Service, which ran the station here, eventually became part of the Department of Health and Human Services, the modern cabinet position level today, and they, one of their subdivisions, the Centers for Disease Control, still runs a set of quarantine stations today. The CDC's most famous quarantine, of course, was when the astronauts came back from the moon, just to make sure they didn't bring any moon germs with them. Now, of course, today we know the moon has never had life, but still it was a worry. And in fact, I assume that when the first astronauts come back from Mars, that they will be quarantined, because we're fairly certain that Mars had life at some point. So, quarantine is a very useful tool in stopping the spread of disease, and will probably be around for quite some time to come.
Alright everyone, thank you for watching. Just remember to like and subscribe to the video, and if there's any topics you think need sciencing, please mention them in the comments below.